start recording. All right. So today we'll be providing an overview of the newly released TNM version 3.2. Next slide, please. The agenda for this presentation is on screen. We will have a formal presentation portion with slides to go over the use of TNM 3.2 and the changes, additions, and updates that were made to it. This will be followed by a live demo of the software, a high-level summary of future development goals, and end with an open mic, or if you prefer, an open chat portion for the Q&A. We will also provide our contact information at the end. Next slide, please. With that, I would like to briefly discuss the availability for use of TNM 3.2. Next slide. As you may or may not know, the FHWA has allowed the TNM version 3 series for use since its release. With the release of version 3.2 and the integration of what used to be the roadway construction noise model, we're further encouraging state DOTs, grantees, and anyone else who uses TNM to make the move to the latest version. You may have seen the language on screen in the release email that went out last month. We would like to remind folks that the 3 series does have some acoustical changes compared to the much older TNM 2.5, and that these changes may require careful thought and consideration by state staff regarding potential effects to their policies and noise abatement goals. More information on the acoustical and technical changes can be found in the documentation for the model. Details on obtaining this information will be covered later in this presentation. With that, I will hand it off to Sophie from the USDOT Volpe Center to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Eileen. Right, so a full change log for TNM 3.0 to 3.1 and 3.1 to 3.2 can be found on the FHWA website, but on a high level, the main changes are, of course, the integration of the roadway construction noise model version 2.0 from the NCHRP project into TNM, including both stationary and non-stationary equipment. We've also expanded the sorting and filtering of all the data grids, both in and out of the barrier analysis module. We've increased how far you can zoom in the maps, and generally fixed a lot of bugs, particularly the one where it would crash in TNM 3.1 every time you tried to divide an object into multiple segments. We've fixed that as well as some other bugs that I will get into later in the presentation. So as far as the timeline goes, trying to move things along faster than in the past. So in January of 2022, TNM 3.1 was out for public release. In January of last year, we already had a beta version of TNM 3.2, and in January of this year, TNM 3.2 was out for public use. So in general, our development goals were to harness the file structure and user interface architecture of TNM 3.1, integrate the RCNM 2.0 construction noise capabilities into that to produce a streamlined model that you can conduct traffic noise analyses as well as construction noise analyses in the same model or even in the same project file if you choose to do so. So the software itself, including the installer that will unpack all of the files into the proper directories, can be found on the FHWA website, as well as all of the following documentation. I'll note that the user's guide and the getting started guide can be found on the FHWA website, as well as in TNM itself. In the help ribbon, there are buttons to access both of those PDFs. And for the validation report, what's currently linked on the website is the TNM 3.0 validation report, which still stands for TNM 3.2, because between TNM 3.0 and TNM 3.1, no acoustic changes were made. It was all removing the database and usability improvements, no acoustic algorithm updates. And between 3.1 and 3.2, we will have an addendum to that validation report coming out very soon, stating the very slight level differences between 3.1 and 3.2. We've done all the testing already, so I can attest that the levels are very slightly different, but just a matter of getting the report through the approval process to be publicly available will happen soon. So digging into construction noise in TNM 3.2. So we've leveraged the RCNM 2.0 database. All 70 of those equipment objects are now available for you to choose from in TNM 3.2. And you can also add your own equipment using measured data that you may have. You can conduct LAEQ and LA max computations for construction noise. LAEQ functionality is a little different than what we're used to for roadway noise, since we're not defined by the policy of that 1 hour LAEQ. You can designate whatever averaging duration you choose for your LAEQ construction noise computations, and the LA max is a new metric specific to construction noise only. So all of the core acoustics of TNM 3.x are leveraged for construction noise, with pretty much the only difference being construction noise calculations are carried out over a wider spectral range from 12.5 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And the attenuation algorithms have been adapted for things like barriers, tree zones to account for that wider spectral range. So all of those spectral results in that wider range are automatically exported to CSV every time a receiver calculation is completed. That is the same for the behavior for roadway noise. And you can calculate for all or active receivers just as you can for roadway noise as well. Difference being you cannot analyze construction noise in the barrier analysis module, cannot use the parallel barrier analysis module. You cannot conduct contour calculations for construction noise, and you cannot include any structural pairings or reflected pairings for construction noise. A big benefit of TNM 3.2 is that it is free. I know a lot of folks struggled with getting RCNM 2.0 up and running due to the licensure that was required. You can access all of the same construction noise capabilities from RCNM in TNM 3.2 for free, no license required. So let's get into the user interface changes. So as I mentioned, most of it is unchanged. We started with the base from TNM 3.1. So if you're already familiar with using TNM 3.1, the learning curve should be pretty slight to get used to TNM 3.2. And if you already have project files, or if you want to create project files in TNM for roadway noise, you can just add the construction equipment objects to those files so you don't have to digitize, all your train lines and barriers and your project area inputs. All of those can be utilized for both roadway and construction noise models. So if you are considering both noise sources in the same area, you don't have to re-input all of those objects. You can have them all in the same project file. And additionally, incorporating RCNM into TNM allows us to streamline future development. So if we need to tweak the acoustics, propagation codes, we can make it a one-stop shop, and those changes will trickle down to both calculations. Now, getting into the user interface changes, starting with the project settings. So when you create a project in TNM 3.1, that is what the menu looks like on the left. And on the right, you'll see what it looks like for 3.2. Excuse me, with these new or updated fields here. The two new fields are the RCNM report metric, where you can choose either LAEQ or LA max. If you do choose LAEQ, then this following RCNM analysis period field will be enabled for you to input the duration of averaging for that LAEQ calculation. And this roadway report metric field is exactly the same as it was for roadway noise, but we just gave it a new label to differentiate it from the RCNM report metric. So in the edit pane, the equipment objects are accessed using this front end loader icon here. And once you choose which object you want to digitize, put it in the plan builder and it will look like one of these two options here. So either it will look pretty much like a roadway object if you choose a non-stationary equipment, meaning its noise generating activity takes place as the equipment is moving throughout the project area. It will look a lot like a roadway. The main difference is the points are square rather than circles. So if anyone may have difficulty differentiating colors, you should be able to differentiate the equipment from the roadways based on the point shape. And this same point shape is used for the stationary equipment as well. That designates where the equipment is located. The noise generating activity for stationary equipment is just while it's in place, so there's only one single point. And this dotted line terminating in an arrow is used to indicate the object orientation. The orientation for stationary equipment can be front, back, right, or left relative to this arrow that always points to the front. And for a non-stationary equipment, just like for barriers, the direction relative to that arrow is right or left. And I will get into why directivity for equipment matters in a little bit later. So in order to add these equipment objects to the project, you'll click the Enable Object Add button, as always in TNM 3.x, and click the front-end loader icon in the Edit pane. Going down to the Equipment Type drop-down menu to choose one of the 70 default equipment objects, or the user-defined equipment objects will also be at the bottom of that list. And once you choose one, these metadata will update to reflect what object you've chosen. So it'll say whether the object is stationary or non-stationary, and it will also give a contextual operation here for an object such as a cement mixer that could be either stationary or non-stationary. Either it's sitting in one place and spinning its drum making noise, or moving throughout the construction site making noise. That's what this field is meant to indicate. You'll notice that there's also an equipment height field, which is unique for each equipment object. Each equipment object only has one source height, which differs from roadway vehicles, but that source height can range from 1 to 25 feet for the default equipment objects. The time active parameter is user editable. You will input this for your equipment objects when you're conducting LAEQ computations to designate how much of that averaging period this equipment is making noise. In the Edit Modify menu, there is a button for equipment objects to select or deselect all objects, just like for the other input objects. And in the View pane, there are toggles for equipment, point, and object labels, just like all the other objects as well. In the section view, this is what the equipment objects look like. You'll see each one has their own single source height designated with this little solid circle here. And they also have heights. So the Z coordinate of the equipment object will designate the local ground height the same way that it would for a roadway or barrier or anything like that. And this screenshot here shows what line I drew in the plan builder to get this section view. Note that for the stationary equipment here, I had to draw that line through the stationary equipment point because this dotted line does not represent anything in physical reality. If you draw the section line through here, it won't show up at all in the section view. But for non-stationary equipment, you can draw the section line through the points or the segments just like you can for roadways or barriers or anything like that. In the legend pane, same functionality as with all of the other objects. You can toggle all of the equipment on and off. This is especially useful if you have both roadway and construction equipment objects in the same project file. and you want to focus on traffic noise analysis, you can just toggle off all of the equipment objects and they will no longer be cluttering your view. You can also toggle all of the equipment object transparency to better view the base map below if you need. In the object details pane, of course, we have a new tab for equipment. There is 3 subtabs in this equipment object details pane here. This first one shows the high-level data for each equipment object. Note that the equipment name, time active, and angle and notes are the only user editable fields. These others are inherent to each equipment object. User-defined equipment will show up in this pane as well. So this stationary equipment object has an angle to designate its orientation, whereas the non-stationary equipment objects do not have an angle input because their directionality is defined by the direction of travel for each segment. And again, you can see each equipment has their own height. Moving on to the points tab. This looks just like the points tab for all of the other objects in TNM. Note that there is a Z coordinate to define the local ground height. And the segments tab again looks very similar to that of the roadways segments tab, where you can designate the equipment to be on structure, which tells the intersection checking algorithm that objects can go beneath the equipment if the equipment is on structure, then it will allow other objects to intersect below it. Moving on to how to actually calculate results for construction noise. So there are now 2 sections of buttons for traffic noise and construction noise separately. So if you click any of these 3 buttons, it will evaluate the noise level or the geometry of all TNM objects apart from equipment, and vice versa. If you select any of these 3 objects, or excuse me, any of these 3 buttons, it will evaluate the noise level or geometry for all TNM objects apart from roadways. So you cannot analyze the impact of roadway objects and equipment objects operating simultaneously. But in the same vein, you cannot, there's no input check rules for roadway and equipment intersecting each other because TNM never sees them exist in the same place. But all of the other objects, barriers, terrain lines, building rows, etc., are evaluated in both analyses. If you click this calculate section button here, that will still conduct parallel barrier analysis, but only for roadways. And if you click either the check inputs buttons, either one will open this validation results pane, showing the error messages for any invalid intersections that may exist in your project file. And all these error messages here will persist. You can click back and forth in any of the other object details panes or in the plan builder, anything to address the issues identified here. They're always there for reference until you either click to calculate a new receiver level, which will of course initiate a new input check before the calculation results can proceed, or directly recheck the inputs using the check inputs button. That will reset the results in this pane to reflect the current state of your project. Once you've resolved all of the errors, it will look like this. This is still the validation results pane with this project is valid message here, meaning you're good to go to conduct your calculations. So once those calculations are complete, you will see the results in either the roadway results or equipment results tabs. This roadway results tab is the same as the calculation results tab from TNM 3.1, with the exception of this new metric column here, which we've added to kind of contextualize with units, because you can compute LAEQ, day-night level, you have other metrics available to you. So we've added this here to contextualize what you're actually seeing. And the same is true for the equipment results tab. The only difference between these two tabs are there is no parallel increase column in the equipment results pane because you cannot conduct parallel barrier analysis for construction equipment. Again, you have the metric tab in there as well for LAEQ or LA max calculations. And these results for equipment as well as roadways can be exported to CSV, using this little button here. Clicking that will open a file explorer to ask you what directory you want the file to be in, what you want to name the file, and it will spit out a CSV file with exactly what's shown in this pane here. Finally, we have the equipment input report, accessed in the reports ribbon. Clicking the equipment object name will open this report that essentially summarizes everything that's in the object details pane for equipment. So moving on to what has changed with the actual acoustics. So for construction noise, we've got two new object types. First being a non-stationary equipment object. As you can see here, this roller is moving in this direction, and there are two microphones here, one to the left of that path of travel, one to the right of that path of travel. This is because in the source database, there are actually two spectra for each non-stationary equipment object to account for asymmetrical emissions due to things like mufflers, generators, anything that may be unequal on either side. The data that are measured for each side are in LAS max units. In that expanded spectral range I mentioned before, third octave bands from 12.5 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And you can define this path of travel with as many segments as you need to in TNM, just like you can with roadway objects. For stationary equipment objects, these are making noise while stood still, such as like a power tool, which can be measured from all four cardinal directions, where the front is facing the control panel. And so the source database has four spectra for stationary equipment, front, left, back, and right, all in that expanded spectral range and all in LAS max metric. I'll note that's the same metric that the roadway noise REML data are in as well. And now, because this object is not actually moving, it's not a line source, it really is a point source, but TNM is not accustomed to the acoustics of point sources. We've kind of tricked it into doing so by designating an extremely short single segment of non-stationary equipment approximated for each stationary equipment object in your project. So that segment will start wherever you stated the equipment object to be located in your project, and will extend 0.3 feet in the direction of that orientation angle arrow. And we've chosen 0.3 feet because that's about the width of a single elemental triangle, which is the unit area of calculation in TNM. And doing so, this 0.3 foot tiny little segment does result in the spherical spreading that you would expect, 6 dB per distance doubling of a point source, whereas the line source, just like roadways, results in the 3 dB per distance doubling as you would expect for a line source. Now, if you don't want to use the default equipment objects, there is the option to input your own measured data. I highly suggest you take advantage of this because, of course, this source database here is not an amalgamation of thousands of measurements of similar equipment objects, like was done for the Remels or roadway vehicles. It's pretty much representative of that one equipment object in that one project site, and that may differ for what's going on in your projects. If you have the measured data available, it'd be great to take advantage of the user-defined equipment so you're more accurately representing what's going on in your project. There are 4 example equipment that are provided in this user-defined equipment.csv file, which is how you input the source data. That CSV file is provided in the TNM 3.2 installer. And these examples are just here to display how the formatting works. Please do not actually use them in your projects. I just made up these data for the sake of illustration. They're not real equipment. Please don't use them. And the TNM 3.2 tech manual has a thorough description of exactly how you should fill out this spreadsheet to define each user-defined equipment, and you will need to adhere exactly to this format, otherwise TNM may crash. There will be a tutorial video on how to do this as well. I'll walk through it quickly today, and you can refer back to the tech manual and the tutorial video that will be coming out as well. So looking at the CSV file, there is this equipment ID, equipment name, and operation name fields that are repeated for multiple rows for each equipment object. This is a stationary object, so it's repeated 4 times for the front, left, back, and right spectra. The ID field here is must be unique. So you'll see here I chose 2000 through 2003 to define 4 different equipment objects. As you define your own, you need to make sure you're not repeating any of these numbers. This name here is what the equipment object will look like in that drop-down menu in the edit pane of TNM. So make sure that this is clear to you, which object you're referring to, and try not to repeat those as well to avoid any confusion. And again, we have the operation name to contextualize the stationary or non-stationary nature of that equipment. The source height field can be anything you want, but it must be expressed in feet in order to get the proper results out of TNM. And the stationary or non-stationary designation is input via the true-false binary condition in this column here. Again, we have front, left, back, and right sides for stationary equipment, and just a left and right side for non-stationary equipment. And the data input here are measured in the LAS max metric. I want to stress that these third octave bands here are energy data. They are not noise levels, they are energy. That is what TNM uses in its source database. Performs the conversion to level in the code. So please input energy here. You must fill out the third octave bands from 12.5 to 20,000 hertz. You need to have measured data for that whole spectral range. But if your equipment object is not asymmetrical in its emissions, you can input the same spectra for each row if that's really the case for your equipment object. Digging into the acoustics a little bit further, the baseline roadway noise acoustics have not changed. So that includes everything from divergence, ground effects, air absorption. All of that is completely unchanged for roadways and also used for construction noise as well. Again, I'll mention the only difference is that expanded spectral range. Another difference is for LAEQ calculations for construction noise. You have this analysis period field that's set on the project level, defining the duration of averaging for LAEQ. And each equipment object will have its own time active parameter, meaning how long it is generating activity, or excuse me, generating noise within that averaging period. So for example, if you wanted to look at an 8-hour workday at the construction site, you would input an analysis period of 8, and you may have a jackhammer operating for 2 hours. So the time active for the jackhammer would be 2, and the emissions for the jackhammer would be scaled for 2/8. So a quarter of the full emissions would be scaled for those acoustic calculations. But you could have another equipment object that may be operating for, any length of time within that 8-hour window. So you set that time active parameter for each equipment object. Looking at the directionality, that factors into the acoustic computations. I'll illustrate that here. For this object, the front is oriented due east based on this arrow. That means this receiver is located between the back and left sources for that equipment. This image is not to scale, but let's say this angle here is 150 degrees. That means this receiver is 60 degrees from the left source, 30 degrees from the back source, and the emissions for the back and left spectra will be scaled appropriately based on that angle relationship. And the front and right sources for this particular source and receiver combination will be ignored. And this angle is evaluated on every source to receiver pairing. So one caveat to that is directionality does impact LAEQ and LA max calculations, but it may result in non-intuitive LA max results. So you may think that the loudest level would be where the receiver is closest to the source. That may not be the case based on the directionality. So in this center image here, we have a receiver that is closest to the source with a level of 97.59 dBA, but where, based on how it's located, it's only seeing emissions from that right side. Moving over to this image here, the receiver is located farther from the equipment source, but it is oriented such that it is seeing emissions from the back of this equipment as well as the right of this equipment. So the max level is actually higher because the back emission spectrum must be louder for this particular object. Conversely, on the left here, this receiver object is oriented such that it's seeing emissions from the front of this equipment and the right of this equipment. And the front must be lower because this LA max level is lower here. Finally, we have the source heights. So as I mentioned, each equipment object only has one source height, but that source height can vary. And when the NCHRP project was conducted, all those measurements of construction equipment were taken. Those measured data inherently have the ground characteristics of that measurement site baked into those measurements. And of course, we all know that TNM also applies the ground effects based on what you have input into your model based on ground zones, tree zones, default ground type, etc. And we don't want to double count the ground effects from the measured location as well as the modeled location. So you have to remove the ground effects from the measured data before calculations can begin. So for the default equipment, TNM already does this, does the same for roadway source data as well. Removes the ground effects from the measured data to achieve the free field condition that it can then propagate over the modeled environment. For the default equipment, you can see the uncalibrated energy as well as the calibrated energy in these two reference Excel files that are also provided in the TNM 3.2 installer, just to show the measured versus free field conditions. And again, TNM is using those calibrated free field conditions in its calculations. So for user-defined equipment, you will need to perform this calibration yourself. You'll notice in that user-defined equipment CSV that I mentioned earlier, there are examples for calibrated and uncalibrated data. If your source height for your user-defined equipment is shared with any source height from the default NCHRP database, there is a table of these calibration factors that are spectral. See that M is a function of F here. So there's a column of data for all the third octave bands for that particular source height that you can just multiply by your measured data here to result in your calibrated data here. And again, those data are in the tech manual. There's some instructions on how to do that in the tech manual. There will also be a tutorial video coming out on that as well. If your source height of your user-defined equipment does not match up with one that already exists in the default database, then you'll have to determine these spectral calibration factors yourself. And again, the process for that is documented in the tech manual, and there will also be a video coming out for that as well. So covered everything for construction noise, but there's also other improvements that we have made in TNM. We didn't just, shove the construction equipment in there, wipe our hands and say, great, another version of TNM out the door. We're listening to you, hearing your feedback, incorporating it to constantly improve the model. And so other improvements that we made from 3.1 to 3.2 include you can now sort and filter all of the data grids in TNM in and outside of the barrier analysis module. You can also export the barrier analysis tables directly to CSV using that little icon here. Clicking that will open a file browser for you to name it and store it wherever you'd like, and it will capture exactly what's in the tables at the moment you click that button. So it will reflect the current perturbations in your design, including all the receiver levels, costs, things like that. We have reviewed all of the input check rules for TNM and documented those in the tech manual, both what the rules are and why the rules exist, the rationale for those rules in the tech manual. And we have tried to give you better feedback to be able to address those errors when they do come up, both in the validation results pane for input check errors or other things like for parallel barrier analysis shown in this message here. Want to kind of make TNM more transparent so that you are able to understand what's happening and address any issues that may arise. As I mentioned before, the results, the spectral results are automatically exported to CSV every time a receiver calculation is completed. You don't have to do anything to make this file be produced. It just, TNM writes it on its own when the calculation is complete, and these files are named to represent what is actually shown. So the spectral results for all receivers in a traffic noise calculation will say roadways in the file name, and the spectral results for all receivers in a construction noise calculation will say equipment in the file name, and the metric will be listed in the file name as well. So if you wanted to look at an LAEQ and an LDN calculation or an LDEN calculation, all of the spectral results will be printed in this directory, and they won't overwrite each other. Same could be said for different analysis periods for construction noise, or if you wanted to do an LA-max calculation, you'll get a new file for each one of those calculations. One thing we have added to TNM is the blocking you from making conflicting edits on the project files. You might notice when you open a project file in TNM 3.2 that this .pid file is created in that same directory with the same file name as whatever file you have open in TNM. This is essentially a lock that if you open another instance of TNM, will prevent you from opening this same project file in that other instance of TNM. So you can't make any changes that may conflict with what you're doing in the other instance. There were some projection settings that were removed between TNM 3.0 and 3.1. We have added those back in for 3.2, so you can now use those. And as I mentioned, there's general bug and stability fixes that happen with every version, trying to make the software crash less often, trying to make it easier to use. Specifically, one that sticks out to me is allowing you to divide objects segments without crashing the model. That's a big improvement for 3.2. Looking at the time. Oh, excuse me, one more improvement. The level of zoom, you can, this is what the default looks like when you open a project file in TNM. This is how zoomed in the map is. And this bottom left picture shows how far you could zoom in on TNM 3.1. This receiver is located on a car just to show scale, even though, of course, you wouldn't put a receiver there. And on the right shows how far you can zoom in TNM 3.2. This pixelated aerial view image is not super helpful, but it's just to illustrate scale. What is super helpful about this increased zoom resolution is if you want to move this receiver by just a couple inches, you can graphically tweak that much easier. I can just edit and drag this receiver on a much smaller spatial scale than you were able to before. And of course that goes for editing any type of objects in TNM. Okay, checking the time. I think we do have some time to open TNM and actually show you. So let me pop that open. This is what TNM 3.2 looks like when you launch it. You will easily be able to tell which version you have open, distinguish it from prior versions of 3.x because you've got this front end loader icon in the edit pane. So if you want to create a project, you launch the new project window and you will see, oops, you will see the new RCNM project settings here. Click LAEQ, and you have the option to type in any number of hours you want here. If you choose LA max, it will gray this out because there's no analysis period input that's relevant to that calculation. Let's stick with LAEQ for now. And again, this roadway report metric is the same as before. You have all the same options that you did before. We just called it roadway to make it clear which one that setting is for. And let's create our project. So we want to add some equipment objects. Click the enable object add button as always. Click the front end loader icon to access equipment. And then we'll pick which equipment object we want. You can see here at the bottom of the list is these 4 example user-defined equipment in that separate CSV file. And as you add more, this list will lengthen to reflect anything you add. But let's choose one of the default ones for now. Go with a dozer, and you can see once I clicked that dozer, it's now updated all of the inherent data about that equipment that's defined in the source database, which you can reference in those Excel files that are provided in the TNM installer. Because I'm doing an LAEQ calculation, I can state how long I want this equipment object to be active. So let's doing a 24-hour LAEQ, but let's say this construction site's only operational for 12 of those hours. And I can then input my object. And because this is a stationary object, only 2 points are needed. And I know this is stationary object because it says draw type point and it says stationary true. So I clicked my single point to state where I wanted the object to be located. And then this arrow indicates where the front is. So if I go into the equipment object details pane here, you can see that it has the checkbox for yes, it is stationary. The time active that I input is here. I can change that if I want to. And this angle parameter here, I can change it by typing in, or I can change it by clicking the edit button and moving this direction around. Let's add a non-stationary equipment object. This one is a pass by, so that'll be non-stationary, which I can digitize as many points as I want to. Double click to finish the object, just like always, TNM. And now I have my non-stationary equipment object. Notice it has a slightly different source height, but I can't change that. That's just inherent to the object itself. I can change the name if I want to, but I can't change the source height. Can't change whether it's stationary or non-stationary, but that is shown here. Again, I have a time active parameter, but I do not have an angle parameter because the directionality for each segment is defined by the direction of travel here. Let's add a receiver so that we can do some calculations. And one thing to note, if there's no roadway objects in this project at all, but if I click in the for roadways section and I tried to compute results, they've got an issue saying there's no roadway. So make sure you're being super careful about which mode you're using. I want to conduct construction noise calculation, so I'll go over to the for equipment section, click all receivers, and the will ask me to save this TXF. And the receiver results are shown here. And I can export these results to CSV by clicking in here. I'm going to call this equipment results. And then I should be able to, oh, I don't have this open right now. Let me open the right folder to look at that file I just exported, which will show exactly what's shown in this equipment results tab. So this CSV can be used to store everything that's written here. And of course, if you added more receivers, there would be more rows in this file to represent that. Okay, let's look at a user-defined vehicle. So user-defined equipment, if I wanted to make a new one, I could pick any number I want, but it can't be one that already exists in here. So well, actually, let's just call it that. That's perfectly fine. We need to make, if we want this to be non-stationary, we will say false. And because it's non-stationary, it needs 2 rows, maybe 8 feet tall. And you can type anything you want in the operation name field. The metric must be LAS facts. You cannot put anything else in here. For a non-stationary object, we must have a left and a right. You cannot have a front and a back because, you know, as you measure it, it's relative to the direction of travel. So if you do front and a back, your source is getting closer to one receiver and farther away from the other, which we want to avoid that, of course. So we got our left and a right. We can put whatever spectra we want. Let's just copy one from here. And like I said, you can put the same spectra in if you have measured it and you know that to be true, you can absolutely do that. I have saved this CSV, and if I go back to the equipment results pane, or excuse me, the equipment defaults pane to try to choose this object, I won't see it there because TNM is already open. And so that TNM reads that CSV file every time it launches. So if you make any changes to that user-defined equipment object, you will need to close TNM, reopen TNM to see that. So let's do that right now. Yes, I want to save that. Open TNM back up. And we should be able to see the user-defined equipment in the equipment defaults pane and choose it to add it to our project. But again, these data are uncalibrated, meaning the it's not free field. The source data from the measurement, the ground effects from the measurement are still included in those source data. So we will need to remove those in order for this calculation to be legit. However, this is just an example, so I'm not going to go through that right now. But if I wanted to add an object that we just created, now you'll see at the bottom of this list, we have demo uncalibrated. We can add it to the project, and it looks exactly like any other non-stationary equipment object would look like, except this box is checked here in the user-defined section. Now, if I really wanted to calibrate these data, which of course I do, in order to actually produce legitimate results, I would need to go to the technical manual and find the right spectral calibration data for my object, which I believe my source height was 8 feet. Yes, equipment height 8 feet. So I would grab this column of data here and multiply that by each of the rows in this spreadsheet here. And I could either overwrite this with the proper calibrated data, or I could just create a new object and call it calibrated. It doesn't matter whether you overwrite it or create a new one, but just note that if you do overwrite it, those changes will not be reflected while TNM is still open, because it reads that file only once when it launches. So if you do calibrate these data by multiplying the calibration spectral factors, then you'll need to save that CSV, close TNM, reopen TNM, and then those source data will be reflected in the database, and you can execute your calculations with that updated data. I think that's everything I wanted to demo live. So I will go back to the PowerPoint and mention one last thing, which is, my apologies, I should have just started the slide, started the presentation from the right slide, but it's too late now. Since 3.2 is already out the door, we are already working on TNM 3.3. And as I mentioned, our development is based on the feedback we receive from users. And so our #1 priority for 3.3 we're already working on is reducing the memory, reducing the file size, reducing the memory required to store all of those data, redoing the memory model such that the project files will be easier to work with. Will be less lag in TNM. They'll be better to share them more easily because they won't be taking up so much space in your hard drive. It'll definitely make the barrier analysis smoother, because right now, when you perturb the barrier segments in the barrier analysis module, those tables are searching through piles and piles and piles of unnecessary data to get what they're looking for. And once we kind of sweep away all of those unnecessary data, there'll be much less to sift through, and the tables will populate much faster in the barrier analysis module. While we're at it, we want to update the barrier analysis module in other ways, including making the 3D view much more useful. I know that perspective view is something that is heavily relied upon in TNM 2.5, and we want to give somewhat similar capabilities in 3.x in the 3D view. So we want to make sure that the iconography is consistent between the plan builder and the 3D view. We want to make sure that there are object labels. You can orient yourself, know exactly what you're looking at. We want you to be able to toggle off the base map if you so choose, so that it's not cluttering your view and it looks more like what it did in 2.5. We also want to improve the linkages between the data grids and the maps. So if you click on an object in the plan builder or the 3D view, it should highlight in the data grids, and vice versa. If you click on an object in the data grids, it should highlight in the plan builder and 3D view. We also want to give you better options for reporting. So as I mentioned, you can already, as of 3.2, export those barrier analysis tables instantly to CSV to reflect that design at the current moment. But the formatting will look exactly like the barrier analysis tables. So we want to kind of formalize those results in the formal reports that are accessed in the reports ribbon outside of the barrier analysis module. So you can have something nicer looking for your reports, and you don't have to do as much post-processing on your own. We want to do the same for barrier designs, as well as costs, noise results, barrier geometry, things like that. And finally, we want to make it easier for you to get data into TNM. So we already have a prototype for, excuse me, I think this is in front of the text here. We already have a prototype that we use to input data for receivers and roadways into CSV formats. You can manipulate it in Excel or whatever program you use to manipulate CSV data. And then TNM will read that CSV and convert the format from CSV to the XML file structure in TNM to basically automatically digitize all of the geometry for receivers and roadways, as well as any other attributes that you're able to assign to those objects, so you don't have to digitize them yourself. And once we have those data into TNM, we want to make it easier for you to manipulate it within TNM by improving the copy and paste functionality, so that it will be more like a program like Excel, and copy and paste rows, columns, chunks, whatever floats your boat, so that it is easier to move things around once the data are already in TNM. And I think that's all of my slides. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can look at the chat and answer any questions. Apologies, I only have one screen, so I had to move things around a lot. There's probably comments in the chat about that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I've been answering them, Sophie.
Okay. So where should I start? If you've been answering them. Or is there anything you want to summarize?
There are a few things that I do want to summarize. I think I'm almost at the bottom of the questions here, so maybe I'll just I think The last, I think, question out there is about the method of importing the data for the user-defined vehicles. Someone wants to be able to do it as entering it as decibels instead of the energy. That's not the way TNM is looking for it. It's not too difficult to do the conversion, and that's, if someone's having some questions with that, we can, help them out on tech support on that. It's a pretty straightforward thing to do.
Yes, it's a simple calculation that is explained in the tech manual, so you can look it up in there, but otherwise, that is actually a good segue. If you have tech support questions, I think I should share one more slide for the contact info. So tech support questions should be directed to TNM help with questions like that. How do I convert from decibels to energy? Or how do I do anything? Also, we would love in this inbox for you to send any feedback you might have. Doesn't have to be a question on how to do something. It can just be, hey, I found this really helpful. Hey, I found this not so helpful. Can we, input this other functionality in future versions of TNM? Everything that comes into this inbox, log it to help inform where we go next with improving TNM. So please, please, please send me all your feedback, as well as any questions you might have in this inbox. This is the contact for Aaron and myself down here. Eileen, who gave the intro, or contact is over here. And George Noel, I'm not sure if he's on, but George is the go-to for the FHWA Resource Center, where they will give TNM 3.2 trainings to anyone who is interested. So please reach out to him for either virtual or in-person interest in training sessions.
Thanks, Sophie. Yes, I'm here.
Great. Stop sharing again. Aaron, is there anything other like kind of FAQ stuff that may have come up in the chat we should address verbally?
I think everything has been addressed in the chat itself. Is there going to be a record of that provided? If so, it might just be easy for people to read the chat. But there's a couple things that I did want to kind of bring up based off of some of the stuff I've seen in the chat. The first one is related to the sources. So one of the things I think it's important to keep in mind is with roadway noise, you're dealing with trying to model the average sound level over thousands and thousands of cars, and all those cars are fairly standardized. So once you have measured 1,000 cars, you have a good estimate of what a car sounds like, and then you can use that to be a template for all of the cars. With construction noise, it's a little bit different. A lot of times the equipment might be 20, 40 years old. It might be in different states of repair. When you're doing construction noise, you have one front end loader or one bulldozer, and there's 20 different models out there by different companies, and they all are a little bit different. So you don't get the same robustness from aggregating data for construction noise that you do from roadway noise. So that's one of the things you need to be careful about. And so the way I kind of look at it is when you're trying to improve your accuracy for a given construction noise study, the first thing you can do is try to get user-defined equipment that best matches the pieces of equipment that you're using, or something that's as close as possible. Let's see, and then after that, then one of the questions was, well, why are we only using a single source height? And that's because the data that we have, we don't have a way of breaking out the source height. So we are using the dominant, or the kind of the point that represents the strongest level. If you have data for your piece of equipment that says, well, hey, I happen to know that and I guess one of the things to point out is like the sources for construction noise are going to be different than roadway as well, right? Roadway, it's tire, engine, and stack height is basically what you're looking at. But for construction noise, the sources that you may be looking at, because you have like exposed engines, you have, you know, so you might be seeing the engine block or the air intake or the exhaust. They oftentimes have very strong gear noise or hydraulic noise. And for some pieces of equipment, it might be, you know, you have banging panels, like either the bed of a dump truck or the bucket of a front end loader. Those things may be making a lot of noises that become a dominant source. So if you have information about that and you want to add that into that, what you can do is you can create a secondary source, and you can basically have it do the same path or same operations as the initial one. And then you basically get the ability to add as many sources as you want, as much as you have data for. So it's really a limitation of data at that point. And the closer you can get to the type of equipment that's going to be used for your study, the better it is. One thing to keep in mind is the directivity is already a huge improvement over previous ones, because again, you know, you on one side of the piece of equipment, you might have the you know, the air intake or the exhaust, and it's going to be louder than the other side. So you're getting those benefits. Yeah, so I think I covered that. Sophie just mentioned the training videos. The other thing, I did want to just add a refinement to what you were saying, Sophie, about the 0.3 foot length for the stationary sources. So when you're using that 0.3 foot length, that is for most cases going to be, you know, an elemental triangle, unless you got into a distance that's unreasonable. But one of the important things about that 0.3 foot length is that was the length that we needed to pick in order to get it so that when you moved around the source, you were getting the same results. If you pick a larger length for that, you're going to see differences between a receiver that's, you know, in front of the vehicle versus at the side of the vehicle because of the way the geometry works out. And that has implications too if you're also trying to do something like that using roadways as well. So as a general rule, I would suggest that, you know, whenever you're trying to do a point source, use a 0.3 foot or less source. And we had to pick a specific one because we had to figure out how to do the integration for it. Those are the main things I was seeing in here. Just to reiterate, running TNM 3.2, you have the options of having roadway objects and construction noise in there. They don't break each other. You can do the calculations for one, or you can do the calculations for the other. They don't affect each other. It's really about being able to use the same terrain lines and barriers and receiver points and things like that. It's not something where you throw everything together, you hit one button and it gives you all the results. It's still doing two sets of calculations. So there's some questions about that.
I'm seeing
Go ahead.
I'm seeing in the chat, will having RCNM in the same model as CNM increase runtimes? Because they are separate calculations, the runtimes are also completely separate. So having construction noise, or even just the capability of computing construction noise, even if there are no equipment in your file, will not slow down your roadway noise calculations, and vice versa. Having roadway noise capabilities will not slow down your construction noise calculations. In general, the construction noise calculations are much faster because they are not saving those copious amounts of extra data that we need to remove in TNM 3.3 to speed up the roadway noise calculations. But long story short, no, RCNM will not impact your runtimes.
Okay, and then I'm just, as we've been talking, I'm seeing another one from Tim Casey about requiring the modeler to apply directionality to stationary and even mobile construction noise seems like an unnecessary feature. So we have provided that feature. You can choose not to use that by providing sources that don't have directionality. You can have the left, right, front, and back all be the same.
And there are some source data in the default database from NCHRP that already are like that. And you can see those source data in the calibrated and uncalibrated Excel files that are provided with the model.
So, what we're trying to do is provide options. There was kind of a similar idea about the analysis period and the time active versus LMAX and stuff like that. There's not one way to do this modeling. We're trying to provide a set of tools for people to do the modeling as it best suits their particular local procedures and local situation. So yeah, if you think something is more than what you need, then it's likely that it's not something that you need to do. It's something that is provided as an option.
And the expanded spectral range for construction equipment does not impact roadways at all. Everything for roadways is still from 50 hertz to 10,000 hertz. The extra attenuation values on either end are not involved in the roadway noise calculations at all, so the results will not change.
Yeah, and then Paul's got a point about knowing what the equipment is on any particular site. He's on a future construction site may be hard to know. Yes, and that's where we're providing a tool to do the modeling. We're not the experts in figuring out how to make engineering judgments on what's the conservative approach and things like that. That's why you guys are getting paid the big bucks there, quote unquote big bucks. What is the excessive data TNM has to look through that is looking to be streamlined in a future release? I'm not sure it was Sophie. Did you say something about excessive data? I was going through the chat, so I may have missed something you said.
Yeah, so better than I do, we're removing unnecessary data from the memory model for 3.3. That's our top priority.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't understanding what that. Yeah. So this is kind of a boring, uninteresting computer science or computer programming question. But basically, in TNM, when you create a model, it's using an object-oriented paradigm. And so you create a very tiny thing, kind of like an elemental triangle, but it's a piece of software code. And that stores a little bit of information. And then another thing picks up that and adds it to a list of all of its things. And then that picks up something and adds a list of everything. So basically you get this tree of a lot of data, and a lot of it is redundant. And that's really the issue, is there's a lot of redundant data in there, or data that's no longer needed. And it just keeps growing as you go through the process. And that has just not been something that has been gone through to clean out. So it's just kind of a side effect of the style of programming that TNM was developed in, which is a very robust and safe way of doing coding, but it's resulted in a bit of bloat in the data. And so we just haven't been focused on that because we've been trying to get other things improved up to this point. At this point, we think that we've got the time to focus on that. And it'll make me as happy as anybody else out there to reduce that, because it does drive me crazy. So I hope I answered that question.
I think you did. Thank you. An answer to this question: why are we wondering about how long an object is active if we want to know when it's the loudest? We're not. If you're doing LA max computations for construction noise, there is no time active parameter. There is no analysis period parameter. It is just this equipment is operating, assuming that every equipment that you have in the model is operating simultaneously. You can't tell TNM otherwise. That's just what it assumes. And there is no scaling of the emissions based on time active or analysis period for LA max.
So the one I see in here, this is a question for Eileen or someone else at FHWA, asking about, this is really, and I'm guessing she's not going to be able to answer it because it's related to the new rule, but asking, is 3.2 going to be required by FHWA is essentially what that question is. So
Yes, requiring any new version of TNM requires the rulemaking. So I can't say what version it's going to be. It just depends on when the rulemaking is completely final. And the process is, you know, the internal review, then we put out an NPRM, we get comments, we revise it, we do the final rule, and it comes into effect. So I'm not sure, but you know, we strongly encourage people to switch to version 3 because of the acoustic updates. We understand that there's shortcomings to the workflows and there's changes to the things that you're used to, and we're working to address all of that, but the acoustic changes will likely have an effect on your state's noise abatement goals, you know, what it is you want to do as a program. So we really encourage people to move over and start getting used to it.
And then from a technical perspective, you know, 3.2 still does have some shortcomings based off of workflow. We're really hoping to get all of the workflow or all of the significant workflow issues finally fixed in 3.3. So we're going to be focusing, I think, Sophie, you had a slide on this, on the memory model. Can you go back to that slide?
Yes. Here we go.
Yeah, so the new data model, reducing the file size, which is also going to help with improve barrier analysis, improve the barrier analysis itself, and improving import options. We think that those three things are the biggest differences in the workflow, and I'm not even sure with I think those are all the three biggest ones. And if you disagree and have something else that you want to, you know, put forward, by all means do, you know, send us a comment either directly or through tech support to let us know. We do take all of that into consideration, and the more people that ask for something, you know, that, you know, helps us understand what the priorities are. But this list here has been based off of user feedback.
Yeah, just to clarify, this CSV importer is not in 3.2. It is, we already have a prototype version of it, but it is not available to the public. We're still testing it internally, and we'll likely expand on its capabilities, and we'll hopefully incorporate it into the next version of TNM. I think I introduced this source of confusion. I'm using the term calibrate for user-defined equipment. It is completely separate from the calibration process that you should absolutely be using when you're measuring source data in the field. That is to adjust the microphone sensitivity to make sure, you know, 94 decibels is 94 decibels. But I'm using the word calibration as a simpler phrase than correcting to the free field condition, removing the ground effects from the user-defined equipment. Is what I mean when I say calibration in the context of user-defined equipment.
So I just see one other question here asking if we know when the rule may come out. I know Volpe does not know, and I have a feeling that anybody that FHWA that is able to say anything does not know either, because as Eileen said, it's got to go through a process, and it depends on, you know, what, you know, the individual actors on, you know, how long it takes for them to move the process forward. I mean, I don't know this as well as Eileen does, but there are certain minimum requirements. So like the notice of public rulemaking, you know, there's certain time periods, waiting periods for responses and stuff like that. So we might be able to guess at a minimum time, but it's likely to be more than that. And I don't know those details.
Jessica, if you mean the NPRM, I don't really have any more news to share than what we shared at TRB.
I will say that in absence of the new rule coming out, I would highly suggest using 3.2, even to just play around and get used to it. I'm not saying you have to use it on all your projects, certainly not. I am saying that it will benefit you in the future to get used to 3.x workflow. because that is not going to change. All of the TNM models in the 3 series will have the very similar GUI, very similar controls. And so the sooner you are able to get comfortable with it, the easier transition you will have when you are, legally required to use a version of 3.x. It'll slow down that learning curve, make it much simpler, and certainly save a lot of heartache. So you're not blindsided by the transition from 2.5 to 3.x when you absolutely have to.
And if that's the end of the questions, then I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank NCHRP for doing the construction noise research, Volpe for all of their work. And we hope you get use out of it. And we hope you use the construction features that we've added. Thank you all.